Hello and welcome to the European Parliament in Brussels. 2 months ago, a new coalition government was formed in Israel. Since then, the Netanyahu government presented legislative proposals which it calls a necessary and long overdue judicial reform, changing the relationship between the executive and the judicial branches of government. Its opponents prefer to call this legislation a coup, which would undermine the ability of the judiciary to serve as checks and balances on the government. They say that should this bill pass, Israel would de facto no longer be considered a democracy. Over the past 9 weeks, there have been unprecedented and increasingly vocal protests. Many pundits agree that Israel is facing its worst internal crisis since its inception. My name is Dan Sobovitz, and together with my panel here, we'll try to understand what is at stake in Israel. Is there a role for Europe in this crisis, and would the new legislation potentially impact EU-Israel relations? And joining us direct from Israel, Dr. Mazel Mazi Avidov Shaul, Executive Director of We Power, an organization which advances women's leadership and gender mainstreaming, especially in the public arena. Mazel Mazi, thank you for joining us. And perhaps before we start, maybe you can tell us a little bit about the atmosphere on the streets in Israel these days.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for the initiative that you are starting in Brisel. I can tell you that atmosphere is very hard. I think that overall I can say that people agree that legal reform should happen. There are things that should be fixed in the legal system, but the way that it happens without consensus and without and again the laws themselves that are expected to hurt the minorities in Israel, and not even the minorities, even 51% of women that in Israel are supposed to be very, very hurt from these reforms that are suggesting.
Before we talk about the reform, we're seeing now images from the streets of Tel Aviv. Maybe you can tell us a little bit what we are seeing. So how does it feel now when you leave your house? How does it feel in those mass demonstrations that we're hearing about and seeing the images?
Well, I can tell you that first of all, I'm participating in most of the demonstration in Kaplan in Tel Aviv. This is the main protest is happening in Tel Aviv. But nowadays, I can tell you that there are more than 50, even more than that, centers all over Israel. Last Saturday, I was in Holon, which is a small city, relative small city near Tel Aviv. And also there were thousands of people. And in Tel Aviv, there are more than 500,000 people. And it's very, very tight. It's very scary. I can tell you that the last protest, the forces of the police really try to let us go from there, and they threatened us, and it was very, very scared, and people were hurt by the police. So it's a little bit it's more tense than the beginning. Now there is also a tent of protest near the Knesset of people that are serving in the armies that don't want to serve in the army anymore in this government.
And to go back to your activity on gender equality, where do you see the link then between gender equality, women's rights, and the current reform that we are discussing?
First of all, the power of the court. There are many cases of women women's rights that were dealt and discussed in the Supreme Court. And nowadays, the reform suggests that they will not be able to do. They are also suggesting that the rabbinical courts will be more straightened. They want to straighten the rabbinical courts in Israel. And this means that, for example, when a woman wants to divorce, she will not be able to discuss it in the civil court, but only in the rabbinical court, which is there. In the rabbinical court, the women has much less rights. So this is just an example. Another example is the gender discrimination in the streets. They want to do a separation between the men and the women.
Sorry, who is they? Who wants to make separation on the streets?
The government. They suggest to push a law push again a law in the government that will allow to separate the women and men from in the public arena.
Okay,
What does it mean?
I presume that you are talking about specific places where a majority of ultra-Orthodox population. We're not talking about all streets now being gender divided. Let me come back to you in a moment. So, Ofri, we just heard
Pulling through this legislation.
Mazal Mazi, if I can go back to you and Israel, since last night there are some rumors that a new compromise is being negotiated, again under the patronage of President Herzog. Do you think any compromise might be acceptable by the two sides? I mean, up until now, the opposition has been saying we're happy to negotiate only if you stop the legislation, the legislative process. Coalition was saying no. If we speak, we're continuing. What is the new compromise about?
Okay, so first of all, I would like to refer to the things that my colleagues in the said before. That I think that yes, first of all, in terms of as a protest, as an activist, I think it's very helpful that there are protests all over Israel, all over the world, to support us and to support our protest, our specific protests. Mm-hmm. So I think this is a good thing that happens. In terms of democracy and being a mature government, you know, we are 75 years old, and I think that it's very, very gentle when other parliaments or other countries are involved in what's happening in Israel. Same, I think that everyone was very careful to get involved in the war between Ukraine and Russia. So I think this is a very gentle balance between getting interfered in an independent country issues, and from the other things to support the protest all over Israel. So this is a little bit to give my opinion on what was discussed before. About the compromise, I think we need to go to the compromise process. I think it's not good now, especially for gender and women rights. It's still not good, and we just last night wrote a letter to the president saying that we are very worried about the compromise outline.
So what is the compromise? What do we know about the compromise?
We don't know much. This is what really disturbs us, because we really don't know what does it mean. What does it mean that you compromise? And who sat around the tables when you discuss the compromise?
So why are you against it then? What bothers you about the compromise if we don't know much about it?
So the thing is that first of all, we want transparency. We want to understand this is exactly what we said to the president in our letters. Last night, we delivered a letter to him from a 20 women organization, feminist organization. And we asked, what does it mean? We want to know what does it include, the compromise. This is first thing. The second thing is, I mean, again, this is a balance between not getting to a brothers and sister war in Israel, because this is the feeling. We feel that we really civil war, really. This is the feeling that the next step will be much more violence, much more aggressive, and maybe even more than that. And we are very worried about it. We don't want to go there, to get there. So I think that the suggestion for compromise outline is good. But again, depend on what does it mean, because there are, again, what we see is that first of all, we are going towards a direction of non-democracy. This is first thing. The second thing, that we are going to a religious country, which is not good, because we don't have only religious population in Israel. So we are very, very disturbed, both from going on again in the same direction. The compromise outline should be much more clear to the public, and to see what does it mean, and what will be excluded from the reform and what will be included yet. I think that even saying that compromise outline will happen, we will be very, very disturbed from testimonies and statements that we hear from the government. Okay, statements that are saying that we are going to do, for example, a law that discrimination based on religious belief can happen. This is a law that they are going to pass.
And gender orientation, businesses could discriminate against LGBT people is also a law that is on the agenda. Speaking of gender, somebody told me last night that one of your complaints was the fact that among the negotiators there are only men. Do you know something about that?
Yes.
That women are not around the table?
Yes, we saw pictures, and I can share with you pictures that we see around about the compromise outline. For example, there is a big meeting, and we see only men there, maybe one or two women. So yes, we are very, very disturbed from that. We don't feel that we are represented in the government. We have only 6 ministers, women ministers, out of more than 36. We have 1 CEO in the governmental offices. We got reduced significantly in the representation of women, and we have only 4 chairwomen of committees. And this is the place where the decisions are getting made, and the budgets are divided. So we are very disturbed from the decrease of the representation of women in the government. And overall.
You have to finish. So you're having the demonstration this evening. You're handing over the letter. What's next for you? Are we going to see regular demonstrations now, or this is a one-off? Or
well, it also depends very much on how things develop back home. If we see that the compromise you mentioned earlier is not being adopted by either party, and if we see that the demonstrations are continuing, then we will continue our demonstrations also here, because we have to stand in solidarity with our loved ones that are fighting for their lives back home.
Okay, with this, I'm afraid we'll have to conclude, and this brings us to the end of this debate on the judicial crisis in Israel and the role Europe could or even should play in it to ensure democracy prevails. Let me once again thank our panelists, Member of European Parliament Dan Sobovitz, Marta Muchnik from the European Policy Center, Ofri Gross from the Brussels branch of the Israel Pro-Democracy Movement, Dr. Mazel Mazi Avidov Shaul from We Power joining us all the way from Israel. I'm Dan Sobovitz, and if you found this discussion insightful, feel free to comment, like, or even share so we can reach more people and keep this discussion going. Until next time, thank you for being with us. Goodbye from the European Parliament.